Hello everyone, welcome to you all, and can you believe it's December? Thank you for joining us at this webinar on trauma and resilience, a workshop with the Dart Centre Asia Pacific. Now, it was during Asia Vision's lessons from the pandemic session a few weeks ago, it became clear that for many in the Pacific media, the toughest professional challenge these past 2 years was not logistics, psychological stress and burnout. With COVID-19 still a huge challenge and the cyclone season on the way, we believe this workshop will be timely. So please join in with your thoughts and questions. As always, we want this to be interactive and informative. And now I'll hand over to our moderator, Asia Vision's Newsroom Chairman, Indra Singh from FBC and the DART team. Deputy CEO Kimina, Lyall, and Pacific Fellow Wame, Valentine. Thank you, Indra.
Thank you, Wendy. Very good afternoon from Suva, where it's everyone's, I guess, still trying to come to terms with the first tourist flight yesterday. After almost 20 months, that is our first commercial flight. And look, reflecting on something good that's happened after almost 8 or 9 months of continuous bad news, and almost over 20 months, almost 2 years, just underneath 2 years of going through a lot of hardships. So that's something to smile about, a little bit at least, as we head into Christmas. But today, as we thank you to the Asia Vision team and the ABU team in Malaysia, Wendy and Shabana, for putting this together. It is, I believe, for us in the Pacific, very important, and it's great also to have the Pacific DART team with us, because they, of course, their insight, I believe, will help a lot of them, a lot of our journalists who are part and parcel of it today. Empty newsrooms, as Wendy, you put it. I go back to FBC some months back when the COVID struck, and our entire newsroom of our entire hardworking team was struck by COVID. It still gives me shivers when I think about that we saw an empty newsroom for the very first time, having covered political crisis and also natural disasters. This is the very first time that we didn't have anyone in the newsroom, and not to have anyone in the newsroom, I compare it to a grave in the middle of the night. People were just shell-shocked to see when that picture came out of what actually the FBC newsroom looked like. And for that matter, some of the newsrooms around the world were also affected and impacted. That was one part of the puzzle. The next part of the puzzle was dealing with shattered staff. They did not know what was happening. They did not know what they were dealing with. We didn't know what we were dealing with, because, of course, none of us had been through that. What was going to come up next? Were we still going to have work? Was COVID going to again react like we had and see us cutting down on staff numbers? Our family members were losing employment. Our family members were staying at home. There was domestic issues cropping up. There were people who were trying to come to work, particularly our females, who were going through a lot of pressure of being sole breadwinners at times, or being single moms who were looking after kids. Then we had teams moving out of their family homes or from their homes to stay in apartments provided by the company, just because we wanted to break up teams. That had a major psychological effect. And believe me, during this time, I saw some journalists going from smoking to drinking to having cover, or looking for ways, which of course I will touch on a little bit later with the DART team, but they're looking for outlets. I have no shame in saying rather, there was at times between colleagues, there's friction, there was stress. There were people who did not think would take out anger on each other happen. And since this is a very closed group, and of course we are trying to help each other out, in the midst of that at FBC, we had one of our colleagues who was not from the newsroom, but from within the company, who was working out of the apartment lose her husband. Imagine the impact that had on my team and others within the company who were staying with her. How do you console her? What do you do? What do you say? And putting all that aside, how do you report? You're reporting on something that's not been there. Uh, that got us thinking as to actually what happened or what's been happening for the past 20 odd months is that mentally each and every one of us, not only in Fiji but in the Pacific, which has been affected in one way or the other, has come to realize that they have different ways of dealing with this. But I truly believe, and we discussed this in the previous forum, is that we really haven't dealt with this. I mean, the depression and stress levels have been up where we've never seen it before. So it's great to welcome the Deputy CEO of DART Asia Pacific, Kimina, Lyall, and also the 2017 DART Pacific Fellow, Wame Valentine. Wame, as most of you might know, has been part and parcel of the media fraternity for a long time and has got experience in talking about what we're discussing. But just before I hand over to the two, while we were fighting the COVID pandemic, in came the crisis in the Solomon Islands just a week ago. And our friends in Papua New Guinea who have been battling their own battle on a daily basis with COVID. And then, of course, there's other countries, places like Samoa and Vanuatu, which have been impacted because of tourism or border closures. So overall, it hasn't been that you've only been impacted by direct COVID, but by all these little factors that have come into play. So I could talk about this all afternoon, but we need to get people involved, and I would like to hear from all those who are here as well. But before that, I hand over to Kimina to start off our presentation this afternoon. Over to you, Kimina.
Hello, thank you, Indra, and hi everyone, and welcome here. My name's Kimina, Lyall. I'm the Deputy CEO of the DART Centre Asia Pacific, and I'm sorry I don't have the team colours behind me. We were trying to solve that technical problem before, but I'm here in all my kind of plain wall background glory, so bear with me on that. So I'm a journalist by background. I worked as a journalist mostly in print for about 15 years before I moved out of that realm and into studying psychology, and I've just actually recently become a qualified psychologist, and I've been working at the DART Centre for a couple of years now, but long connection with the DART Centre, and it really is an amazing organisation that I hope all of you who don't know much about will continue to learn about. I've got a little bit of a very quick presentation. We're not doing too much death by PowerPoint today because we want this to be a conversation, but I just wanted to give some context to kind of start with. So I'm just going to start that now. And really just looking at, we understand that being a journalist is actually a high risk job. There's all sorts of dangers that that we get exposed to. From threats to our own physical safety through to kind of being randomly caught up as a result of our reporting in some of the biggest news stories. And as we know, the news stories, the greater the level of trauma inherent in the news story, the bigger the story is. And so the more intense it is for all of us who cover it. And it's not just out being in the field, it's also being in the editing booth, being in the production line, being exposed to images that you need to kind of sort through and edit away from public eyes because there's too much detail, too much graphic detail in it. It's really important that in order to continue to do our really, really important work, we have ways that we can actually respond and adapt to this constant inflow of quite difficult visual, auditory and emotional information. And that's really at the heart of what the DART Centre is about teaching journalists and people who work in the media how to actually become resilient, to be able to have the resources to deal with it. So what is trauma and what is the trauma response? Well, a traumatic event is one that involves life threat, extreme violence or sexual violence. It doesn't have to happen to you. You can witness it happening to others and you can experiencing it electronically if this is part of your job. So it is in the kind of,
Bible of psychological issues. If you are involved in a job that requires you to look at violent images, then that puts you immediately in the risk category. What happens when you're exposed to this, even if you're just watching it on a screen or editing in an editing booth, your body will go into the emergency mode as if you were the one under threat, as if it were happening to you. And that emergency mode impacts on the brain chemistry, impacts on structures, it changes how your sleep is affected, how your appetite is affected. A whole bunch of things occur because your body has gone into survival mode. Even if the trauma didn't happen to you, even if you're just hearing about it secondhand or third hand. So it's physical and emotional responses. There's another newly emerging field of study around continuous traumatic stress, being involved in an ongoing life and work situation that there's no respite. So one example, and the example in the image there is the kind of the Black Lives Matters movement. We would argue that COVID is another example of that. So when you're in, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to let you know that there's a whole bunch of really complex things that happen in the brain as a result of trauma that affect your ability to think, affect your ability to feel, affect your ability to use language, affect your ability to sleep, and a whole bunch of other systems. And this is out of your control. This is not something you get to kind of override. There are strategies you can do to support yourself, but you don't get to actually decide, oh, I'm not going to have a response to the situation that I'm in. And something that's really key to understanding trauma is that it's not the same as stress. Stress is a situational experience where there is a demand placed upon you and you don't feel like you have the resources to deal with that demand. So there might be deadlines, you might have a sick child, you might be going through a divorce, you might be fearing that you're going to lose your job. These are stress-related things. But what happens when we have some stress in our life is that when we are then exposed to a trauma situation, say, for example, we cover a story with a bomb, or there's a sexual assault, or there's a child that dies and you're out there in the field or reporting on it or processing it in some way. And it just adds to that kind of how much store you have inside of you, depending on what your original stress levels are. But if your stress is really high and you end up having a trauma, it can spill over and actually create a situation where it is you are no longer coping. So it is really important to reduce stress at all times. So what's COVID got to do with all this? Well, COVID is this kind of relentless, as Indra's already said, this relentless story that's just not going away, but that it affects us all personally. We're not able to just go and report on the story. It's in our community. It's people we know. In addition to that, there's a whole bunch of fear about, I go out and do my job and I come home and bring the virus home to my family. There's stress and it's trauma. It's trauma because we are seeing the impact on the hospitals, the impact of, shortages of oxygen, the impact of people losing loved ones. And it's stress because it's relentless and it requires a whole lot of personal resources that might not be accessible to you or be able to maintain over time. And, one of the key things that actually helps us survive difficult times in life has been taken away from us. And that is interaction with other human beings, connection with others, camaraderie, collaboration. All of those things are gone now. And we now have turned into these kind of walking PEP bodies trying to do our jobs. So there's an accumulation that can come up where it just continues to take its toll. And the more that you do and the more you see, the more likely it is that there's long-term consequences. But there is a solution or there is a response, and that is about actually making sure that you have as much control and as much autonomy over your working scenario as possible. And that's where we come into trauma resilience. And there are 3 areas in the Dart Centre that we think are really, really vital to continue to become resilient to trauma. The first one is demonstrated in this picture here, which is social interaction. And I know that, you know, in the days of Zoom, and hopefully some of that's sort of shifting now, but that was really hard. But there's just reaching out to another human being. We are social creatures. We cannot survive on our own. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to reach out in order to debrief or talk about what you're feeling. It's just share a cup of tea and some cake, or go out, you know, to watch a footy match, or, you know, just have some kind of interaction with someone that you care about. The second one is exercise, is actually maintaining your physical body and moving the hormones that have got the stress hormones that are building up in your body, moving them out through exercise. Doesn't matter what kind of exercise, it's just exercise and do it. It's probably well, all of these are really, really important. So don't forget any of these. The third one, strange image, but it's about a sense of purpose. It's about there is something worthwhile in what I am doing. I am achieving something important. My job is important. It's informing the community. It's helping to keep the community safe, whatever it is for you. So those three things we call the golden triangle of resilience. So social support, exercise, and a sense of clear purpose or meaning in your work. And they will help you stay strong as you navigate what you've been through and what's to come. I'm going to end it there for now, because we did really want to have this be conversational, but very happy as the conversation goes on to talk about any of these a little bit more detail.
Thank you,
Back to you,
Kimina.
Indra.
I think very thank you again. Very interesting. I think exercise is something that we in the Pacific sometimes think should be last on our list, but excellent point, which is very helpful for everyone. Right. I'd like to bring in Wame Valentine. And Wame has been working with us at FBC some years back, and he's been with the media fraternity, and he's been around as well in terms of doing things and knows the media landscape. Well, Wame, a very good afternoon. First of all, with you, I think we'll take it from the Pacific perspective. How have you seen, from your expertise, having been part of DART, as to what we have in this part of the world, at least in Fiji and in the Pacific, have had to cope with? And it's very interesting the way you break down between stress and trauma. You would have noticed what our media personnel have had to go through for the past 20 odd months, Wame.
Yeah, Vinaka, Indra, Vinaka to you. Good to see you again, Kimina, and Bula to the rest of the participants who are joining us. Happy to be here. Yes, it's been a very interesting 20 months, and I love that you've made a distinction, Kimina, between stress and trauma. As when I was initially joined the DART Center for Trauma and Journalism, I was also confused. I would always raise things that were towards, but were not necessarily trauma related. You know, I've no longer in mainstream media, Indra. I've for the last 3-4 years, I've moved into development communications, having been in broadcast, radio, television, and in print for some time. But I've really, like most people who are not frontline workers anymore, I've really just been at home observing everyone else and really being in touch with my colleagues who are frontline workers, basically those of you who are members of the media, members of the press. It's been incredible. It's I can't imagine what that's like. You know, being locked up here at my home, I thought it was tough, but being on the front lines, reporting, and really being on the front seats of incredibly moving and confronting scenes of severely ill people here in Fiji, at least, who we've had with COVID in a massive way, unlike certain other parts of the Pacific, and also now with Papua New Guinea, having to deal with high death numbers and just watching those of you, members of the press, having to report them and then go home or you know, go to the different facilities that you had to stay in, worrying about not only your life, but the lives of your loved ones and your families. Incredibly confronting. But I think you know, this pandemic has sort of brought trauma up to a crescendo, because for years and years and years, members of the press, and I'm going to speak as you know, as a Fijian, and my observations of the Fijian media, we've always covered really confronting stories. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine had to cover a incredibly stressful story of a parent who unfortunately murdered his children by drowning. And it's difficult, and we had to read this, of course, on the news. This colleague of mine came about, was on the scene even before the police and the ambulance work, because usually members of the press are usually there, not only at the same time with the police, but sometimes even there before they turn up. And they had to file a report and cross over to Suva for the 6 or 7 o'clock news bulletin. And this individual has children. And I remember talking about this, how this person had to sort of compose themselves and just look straight down that camera and say the news, while unfortunately the bodies lay a couple of feet away. And it's interesting because I never thought of this until I joined that center, until I was part of the group, was that we've always covered very tough, traumatic stories without really thinking that this is doing me damage. I've been affected by this. And what it has led to is many of us would deal with it in different ways, not really knowing that we're dealing with trauma. Some of us would tend to smoke a great deal. And I'm not here to criticize, anybody or what they choose to do, but some choices we make in order to cope with trauma was not helpful. It was damaging to our health and damaging also to our mental state. This is for those who in the newsprint media in Fiji at least would know. Many of us would quite addicted to nicotine. During every break you'll see us outside going through a couple of cigarettes, and I've known close friends of mine who would smoke a pack or two a day. I'm not a smoker, and I remember looking at them and thinking, well, thankfully I'm not dealing with that issue. But then without knowing, I would also drink as well. And that's my way of coping, Sometimes I wouldn't go home until I'd had 1 or 2 nice stubbies of Fiji Gold, and then I'd able to go home and even sleep, a couple of years back. It was damaging until I joined the Dart Center and really listened in to their presentation and realized, right, this is not helping. This is what I'm doing. I'm sitting down, writing a story, interviewing this individual who went through a very traumatic, event, for instance, like rape. And I have to listen to very detailed information, which I then have to put together into a 800-word piece that's palatable to the audience. And there's a lot of information that one would cut out that you think, right, this is just a bit too much. But then you have to live with that. You live with that information. I think of some of the colleagues who sit in the courts, in the high courts, from morning all the way through till noon or even up until the afternoon, and have to listen to case by case of very disturbing stories from witnesses on the stand with very graphic details. This does affect us in the long term, not only in our mental health, but really functioning in every sense. And now with COVID, it's just brought everything up to a peak. One thing I've really learned from participating with the team at Dart Center is the importance of having friends, having a support system, particularly amongst colleagues in the media fraternity. It's different to have a friend who's maybe is in a different sector, but when you have a colleague who works in the press, you and them, what it's like. And you don't necessarily need to sit down and talk about how stressful your day is. You could just do something mundane as just sharing stories, watching a game, watching rugby, or sitting down together and having, as Kimina had mentioned earlier on, a cup of tea, some biscuits, some bread, and just having a good laugh. It wasn't until I realized different sort of steps one could take to cope with trauma in a healthy manner that I realized, right, this is, we should probably go down this path. And that's what we've been doing, actually. In the last 20 months, it's been difficult, of course. We've all been at home isolating. So what I've done with 3 other colleagues of mine is we've started sort of like a messenger group, which we've just, message each other, check in on each other, how they're doing, when I notice that they'll put a story out that's quite troubling, I'd send them a message, give them a call, not talking about the story, just asking them how they're doing, asking about the family, and really just having a laugh. And it's incredible, you know, the wonders that this does to your mental health and just to your general state of being. And these are incredible tools that, you know, they seem very simple, but we've never really given it any thought prior. I certainly didn't. And moving forward, I'm quite happy to, you know, just to continue with it. One thing I also, just very quickly before I give it back to you, Indra, one thing I think is really missing in the discussions, or perhaps, you know, in the spaces, in the media spaces in Fiji, and to an extent the Pacific, is this very important subject, trauma, that I've never heard about, at least trauma in journalism, until I came across that center a couple of years ago. And I think I'm very appreciative of this space, that we're bringing this to the forefront. And I certainly hope that the colleagues of mine, yourself, your team, who are in the front lines of the media in this country and across the Pacific, will continue to discuss this.
Thank you, Wame. Great insight there. And definitely, it's no shame where I've worked for almost over 10 years now here at the FBC. I think what Wame touched on was very important. Whenever you get stressed, some of our colleagues, some of ourselves, is you light up a cigarette, or you have to get together at night. But again, while we think of it as a social activity, I think what Wame touched on is very important. We are not realizing that using that as an outlet of coping for what we're going through. The floor is open. Please feel free to ask your questions, because it's not only about us speaking, or the two guests that we have of speaking, because they'll be very happy to answer and help you in what we are discussing. While we do that, and then let Wendy and Shavana look at if someone's got questions, I just want to go back to something very important. Now, I've read a little bit about it, and it's also very interesting what Wame mentioned and what Kimina mentioned at the top. We take stress, depression, and of course now trauma. Going back to one of my editors in the North Office, covering an airplane crash for about a week and a half or two, and we didn't realize until sitting down and talking to her, is the trauma of seeing bodies being brought in from the mountains, or the plane pieces being brought in. So that's of course trauma that now we sort of understand when we talk to the DARTS team. But Kimina, when do we know, as maybe editors or managers or as colleagues, as Wame mentioned, where you get together and just talk about it, when do we know to step in and help? Because many a times some people are so closed up that they would never sort of open up to ask us for help.
Great question, and I think is not a straightforward answer. I think the second part of your question, many people are closed up and they won't necessarily reach out for help. I think that's about a culture change. Oh, apologies, there seems to be a fire smoke alarm or something going on here. Hopefully you can't hear that. I think I'm safe. Yeah, there's a culture change that's required, where we remove some of the stigma around saying, hey, that one got in. You know, I like to think of it as one got in. You know, you go and cover story after story after story after story, and you're out there and you're on fire and you're reporting and you're getting the interview you need, and you're coming back and you're pulling it together and you're getting it to the bulletin in time and everything's fine. And then one day there's something about that story that gets in. Is it because the child is the same age as yours? Is it because it's just the 769th and 768 was your limit and you didn't know it? There's just something that happens, something that sort of shifts, and the physiological trauma response kicks in, and that can lead to emotional responses. And I think we need to firstly destigmatize that, but that is not something to be ashamed of. That is not a failure. That is not a weakness. That is not something you did wrong. It is just something that is just an occupational hazard. In the same way that, you know, we go out every day driving around in traffic, and, you know, there's a statistical chance that, you know, we might be involved in a car accident. That's what happens. It's bad luck, and we all rally around and support you and help you recover from that. So I think we need to start thinking about the trauma response in that same kind of way, that this is something that is an occupational hazard. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it can happen to any one of us. And there's no kind of shame in saying, hey, this isn't going so well for me right now. So that's the sort of second part, I think, to sort of encourage people to disclose. And the only way we can do that is by disclosing ourselves and doing what Wame did, and doing what, you know, what we're doing here today, of just kind of saying, this is what a lot of us experience. You know, I lived through, you know, some pretty tough stories in my time as a journalist, and, you know, just like that, most of them were fine, and then one got in and I wasn't able to kind of bounce back. But I also like to see, there's two kind of main points I want to make. Firstly, it's not inevitable. It doesn't mean just because you see a dead body, you're never going to be able to work again, right? Just because you've covered COVID for 20 months, that's it. Your career is over. You're hopeless now. There's no hope for you. It is not inevitable. And in fact, those three kind of things, the social connection, and the purpose, the sense of purpose, is what drives us and keeps us strong as a group of journalists. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make, if it does get in, if it does undo us a little bit and unravel us a little bit, I like to think of it like an injury rather than a sort of a psychological disorder. If I break my arm, say I have that motorcycle accident or something and I have a broken arm, well, I can't write, I can't pick up my cup of tea while I've got the broken arm. But if I do the right things and I put it in a cast and I do what the doctor says and all the rest of it, then over time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it might be, it'll eventually, and then one day it'll be the same as it ever was before. Maybe I'm more likely to get arthritis or something later, but, you know, basically I'll be fine. And I think trauma is the same. It's an injury that can be temporary if it's treated well, and you have the right kind of supports around you. You can grow through it and come out the other side and go back to having a fulfilled and happy life. So I think these are the messages we need to keep making sure people hear, and people in the media hear. I hope that answered your question.
I wonder if I could quickly end on Indra, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure, go on, Wame. And then we have a question from the floor straight after that.
Great, thanks. I'll be brief. This is my own personal opinion. You know, Kimina had mentioned, you know, about changing the culture, and that is incredibly true. I also would think that it's, you know, in response to your question about how do we get someone to open up, to discuss trauma, I think it's also understanding the culture, just changing it, but understanding it as well. I'm Fijian, I'm a man. Generally speaking, Fijian males don't necessarily open up, regardless if you are a frontline worker as a journalist, or if you're a home dad, or if you're a farmer, or you're a taxi driver. Generally speaking, you know, it is in our nature, in our culture, we don't generally open up. I think what I've always done to sort of approach that is, I've always liked to create a safe space where the issue isn't brought up and they're confronted. You know, we could talk about something that's easy for the parties to discuss, something that they're comfortable to talk about, something that's safe. And once a safe space is created, you'll just naturally move into that space where they will feel comfortable enough to trust you and open up. It's different. You know, I've, of course, have colleagues from different cultural backgrounds, female colleagues as well, many of whom are very comfortable, you know, straight up to open up in Talanoa and talk about what they're dealing with and what they're going through. And I don't know, Kimina, if, you know, that makes sense, but I've always found that, you know, one would have to sort of read the room, read the person, and try to understand what do I need to do to create a safe space so that him or her is willing to discuss the issues.
There's a question there, Indra.
Yeah, sure. That's what I'm going to from Shabana. I don't know if it's your question or if someone sent it to you, but the question is, either one of you from that can answer this. The question is, where do journalists go if they are facing trauma, and who will support them? So that's a brilliant question. I think particularly for the Pacific, where a lot of our journalists and media people are not aware of. And as Wame mentioned, unless and until you get involved with something like that, where you pick this up. So either of you, the floor is yours to answer that question that we have just got.
Yeah. Have I got my microphone on? Yes, I have. I want to avoid the answer that you need to go to a counselor, or you need to go to a psychologist, or there needs to be some kind of debriefing. It's not that that's not true for some people. It is true for some people. That is true. But again, I think it's really important that we don't make this a kind of inevitable mental health. I don't think learning about trauma is a mental health response. This sounds like a really crazy thing for me to say. I think it's about becoming skilled in our profession, skilled as journalists, skilled as media professionals of how to navigate challenges in front of us. We learn how to cope when the tape breaks, the equipment breaks down. We learn how to cope when our source won't give us the information that we're needing. We learn how to cope when the government sort of restricts access to important information. We're constantly working out how we kind of get around all of these obstacles. And trauma is just another skill that is required to be learned to how to respond and how to deal with it. So that's my kind of first initial answer, is that it's not always about run off to the nearest counsellor and psychologist. And part of that is that I know there isn't enough anyway. So if we're sending people who don't really need to go there, then that's not an efficient use of those resources, because there will be some people who do need that answer. I obviously don't live in the Pacific, and I don't know all of your countries and all of your different circumstances in all of the countries that you're all joining us from. But I will encourage you to stay in touch with the Dance Centre. We have lots of information on our website, lots of tips, lots of webinars, lots of supports that you can use and access to become better informed about this. And then the next thing I would say after that is be there for each other. Be there to kind of just be the friend, not the professional, not the expert, just the educated ear that sits down with each other and says, I hear you, I know what that feels like, I've had a similar experience. If you're doing that and you are talking to someone and you do think it's beyond just, a friend conversation, then I guess you have to rely on your own resources to find those sort of more professional supports in your country. But I do think it's not necessary that has to be always the first answer. Hope that answers the question.
Great, Kimina. I think we've great stuff. I think we've also got, it's great to see that we have got Pakistan, some of our colleagues from Pakistan on. They are more than welcome to pitch in, because they've got a lot of experience which will benefit our Pacific Islanders. Now, the next thing is that while I'm waiting for, we are there for each other. I was going to touch on that. It's great, and what Wame mentioned and what you mentioned, Kimina, just to be there for each other. Now, being there for each other and helping each other out takes you a long way. And of course, not everything is a mental issue, as you mentioned, Kimina, because automatically sometimes people think referring people to psychiatrists could be the answer, which is not. And great point. But just bringing Wame into this, Wame, you know this maybe better than most from other part of the world. Being there, and then those same people breaking your trust after having been there and talked to you about it and trying sort of to help you, and they break the trust because, as in Fiji we call it the Kakase group, or the group that likes to talk about other people's problems starts to originate. That sort of also adds to the mental side of things, and maybe people realize that there's no one actually there really within their circle to help them, and that's when they shut it up. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Wame, that could play a major part in trying to seek help from your fellow colleagues and not looking like fellow colleagues, but at the same time not trusting them.
Yeah. No, Indra, that's a whole different show. We could be here all afternoon. That's right. it's difficult to find someone who you could trust. Ultimately, we live in a space now, and it was funny that you bring this up because I was just talking about it with someone before we came on. Finding people who are trustworthy, finding people who you can depend on. They're few and far between, and I guess for me it's always been trial and error. I'm someone who's always I observe a great deal. And I look at someone, I would inquire with other people to sort of gauge how they are. But more than that, and I think different people have different approaches to finding a good support group. I'm fairly good at reading people. When you're around someone who has a good energy and a good vibe, you wouldn't, initially in meeting someone, you wouldn't open up immediately. Like most relationships, you'll get to know each other, and over time, trust will be built. So, in this sort of field, and especially when you're trying to find someone to trust, and if you want to talk about issues that you find are important and are personal and are sensitive, before you do so, it's good that you have a good understanding or a relationship with someone to know that you could trust him or her well enough. The message group that I have are colleagues of mine who I've worked with for almost a decade, who I have their back and who I know they have my back as well. Again, this is an issue of culture. Here in Fiji, we have the Ritaugu, and I'll explain that very briefly, and maybe you could do it better, Indra, for those who are outside of Fiji. It's traditional links between folks from different provinces. You usually have a friendly rival. And generally for us Fijians, that's just sort of how we cope. We deal with a lot of things through humor, and by extent, most of the Pacific as well. I remember the Dart Center Fellowship in 2017. Our friends from the Kiribati who were doing a presentation about something. They were covering a story of a house fire, and there were unfortunately bodies that were in there. And they were sort of just talking about it and just sort of smiling as they were discussing this. And our colleagues from Australia were sitting next to me, were sort of just stunned that they could just smile through this. And I leaned over and I said, we've dealt with so much and we've covered so much in the Pacific that generally our way to cope is just is being happy, just to smile through it, because the alternative isn't very good either. So, with these friends of mine who we've started sort of this support group, albeit virtually, we've known each other a long while. And thankfully, they've always been trustworthy individuals who are top of their field, and I could always depend on, and they could always depend on me. But it's really, it's sometimes it happens when you trust someone who you thought was something and turned out to be someone else, and that happens, and that's okay. I guess that's life. That happens in almost all sorts of relationships, not just with friendship, even in family and personal relationships as well. But you deal with it, you cope with it, you pick yourself up, and you move on. One thing though that I would encourage our colleagues who are watching in this afternoon or this morning, wherever in the world you are listening in from, is don't resign yourself, don't feel like you have to be an island if you encounter a sort of roadblock as such, particularly with finding someone who has misused your trust or you cannot depend on. Kimina mentioned earlier on, we're social creatures. The only way we can thrive is via relationships, healthy relationships with other people. And so I encourage you to look around you. Sometimes these people are right under your nose. So one doesn't need to look far. They're sometimes right under your nose. They may not necessarily look like you. They may come from a different background, but have an open heart, have an open mind, and you'd be surprised.
Can I just add something? Can I just add something quickly to that? I think I agree with everything Wame said, and I do think it's about finding your person and finding the people that you have a relationship with that you can trust. And my suggestion would be start with someone who covered the story with you. It might not be from your own organization, it might be from another media organization, but they covered the same story that affected you, and just say, hey, that was tough, huh? And, you know, then they might go, yeah, that was pretty hard. And then, you know, that might be enough. That might be enough to just have someone else accept and understand your experience in the way because they shared it with you or shared a similar experience. But I guess what do we, if we do go further and talk more about how we're feeling, and then there is that sense of my story is going to be, you know, told to other people against my wishes, I'm wondering what exactly are we talking about here? I'm talking about a situation where I cover a house fire where some children have perished, and I'm admitting that I felt sad. Like, is that such a terrible thing for other people to know about me? And this comes back from this idea of the changing the culture, you know, this culture in journalism that we've had for so long, where we have to be objective and detached and not emotionally involved in the stories, and all of which is, you know, there's some good reasons for why we need to be objective, but it's also denying our own humanness. And so to say, you know, yes, I was upset when I saw that thing, or when I heard that thing, or when I interviewed that person who was so distressed, that just makes me a human being. Great. I don't really care who knows that about me now. But I also acknowledge that, yes, when I was severely affected by trauma, and there was a period of time when I was very wounded, then yes, I kept my confidences very close to me and to people that I knew cared about me. I didn't put it on Twitter, but that's just me. And I know there's a question in the chat for me. Should I take that now, or did you want me to wait?
Just hold off the question for
Okay.
a moment, which is from Wendy. I'd really like for those online this afternoon, because Kimina and Wame have given some brilliant explanations, and they can do that all afternoon. But we need to know from you, what are you facing? Because at the end of the day, it is about you. You are on the field, you are the editors, you are the journalists, you are the young people, you are the editors, as I mentioned, and you are doing this on a daily basis. You're going out into the field. And mind you, a lot of people compare the Pacific Islands and say we don't have wars and we don't have daily deaths and we don't have that. But times are changing. We've seen what's happened in Fiji, over 600, 700 deaths. We've seen what's happened in the Solomon Islands in the past week. We've seen what's happening to our friends in Papua New Guinea. So you are experiencing this. So we'd like to hear from you. Even if it's not a question, it's something you want to add, how you're dealing with it. And before I go to Wendy, I was just going to ask, and maybe we'll take this one afterwards. While we talk about trauma and something that occurred to me sitting here with Wame and Kimina, you'd cover a child out in the field who is just, or cover the death of a child. You go home and you hug your 3-year-old like no tomorrow, because that makes you realize that this could happen to us. A lot of people might see it in a negative way, but I think that's a positive aspect, because it's also helping you build your relationship with the family. Maybe just a quick one on that from your side, and then we can take Wendy's one. How long does it get to take over, or how long does it take to get over the trauma, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. That, you know, there's a lot of evidence now about this this phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, where people actually come through a traumatic event or a traumatic situation, and it changes their relationship with themselves and their relationship with other people in ways that, in addition to, you know, challenging, is also helpful to them. So that's a little example, that one of you coming home and connecting with your child because you've covered a story about a child who's perished. I will just say one quick thing on that though, which is that if you are covering a story where there has been harm to a child, and that child is the same age and gender as your child, be very, very precautious of your own psychological safety. It is an element that it's called psychological proximity, where you have something in common with that family or something in common with that person. And it does mean that there is more chance that you might be have longer effects of it. So if you're an editor or a chief of staff, and you've got two reporters in the newsroom, and one of them's got a 6-year-old girl and the other one's, you know, hasn't, I would always send the person who hasn't to stories like that, because there is much more heightened danger. It's not just about children, but anywhere, you know, if it's your family group or your village or your whatever it might be, if there's some kind of psychological proximity you have to that story, then that does make it harder. And again, COVID's just blown all that out of the water, right? Because none of us have been able to escape psychological proximity to COVID. So the question, do people take long to get over it? Some people don't. That's the truth. Some people have, you know, very, very permanent impacts of trauma. However, they're usually the people who weren't given good support in the beginning, and it wasn't attended to, or there were too many kind of pre-existing traumas building on top of each other before the first kind of help came. So I don't, again, very small proportion, but I guess I'm not going to lie, it does happen. In terms of, do people take long to get over it? I'm not really sure what the question means. Like, as in, do you mean I went out and I covered a house fire? Let's use that analogy, that example we've used a little while. And then the next day I felt really bad. And then the day after I still felt bad. Is that what you're talking about? Or do you mean I've got 20 years of covering, you know, wars and famines, and I'm just finding I don't have any resilience left? So it depends, I guess, on the context of the question before I can really give it a clear answer.
Okay, no, we'll wait for that with Wendy. Now, we talk about support system, and both of you have mentioned this very much. Again, we're still waiting for others to join in and to ask. Please do ask if it's going to help you. The support system needs to be great. I mean, it goes without saying, be it for work or family, etc. I'll cut that to editors and managers, and what you mentioned at the top of your presentation, Kimina. Get the story, get the story, get the story. They are under the pump because they got to do it first. You got to publish it first. You got to break it first, and that's the norm around the world for media fraternity. Mm-hmm. How much of a role does an editor, him or herself, or the manager play in the lives of journalists and how to help them deal with trauma? Because I mean, I come from a background where I lead a newsroom of about 30. And believe me, if I was to deal with somebody who's going through a traumatic experience, I might try, but I don't have that expertise to maybe help them. I could talk to them, I could refer them, I could talk to them as a fellow human being. But from my observation, at least in the Pacific, the editors and managers are not given enough training, at least not from the organizations that they come from, to be ready to deal with things like this. And I think the downfall of this was very much highlighted during COVID, where a lot of managers or editors were not ready to deal with situations as such. And apart from just enrolling in things with that, I think I'm just making a statement here that the hierarchy or the higher level of any newsroom needs to be trained to deal with this, which is very important now that we're heading into the unknown on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think, well, firstly, editors mostly are former journos. So they've been in the field, they've been exposed to whatever they've been exposed to while they were out on the road. And so they also are at risk of having accumulated impact, and that sometimes affects their judgment. I will say that don't overcomplicate it. If you have someone who's had a tough story, you don't underestimate how important it is to just say, wow, that was tough. You did a really great job in really difficult circumstances. And I could see that story was a hard story to do. And I'm not surprised if you feel a bit sad. You don't have to be a counselor. You don't have to be a kind of medical professional. You just have to be a human being. And the power of just acknowledging something that's true, rather than kind of pretending, because I'm too scared to open that conversation because I don't know where it's going to go, so I'll just pretend it's not happening. I would very much encourage the former. And, you know, in my experience and experience of many, many people that I've trained through DART over the years, that's often all people need is just their boss or their commissioning editor or whatever to say, wow, that was an amazing piece of work that you did in what was a really tough environment, a tough story.
Yeah, definitely, Kimina. I think just one question there. Either you or Wame could take that, and I don't want to keep it too long because a lot of the newsrooms in the Pacific are producing the news bulletins for the afternoon. So from Elizabeth, is experiencing trauma a hazard to relationships in the long term, guys?
Do you want to have a go at that one, or shall I?
Go after you, Kimina. Go ahead.
Yes, in positive and negative ways. If you, as a result of your experience of trauma, get stuck in the trauma and become very hyper anxious and very irritable and depressed, as some people do, then yes, that might impact your family relationships. If, on the other hand, you use it as a way to grow and reflect in yourself and to appreciate the gifts in your life, which other people in your life, then it can have a positive impact on your relationships.
Great stuff. Now, while that was Elizabeth, she's from the Solomon Islands Broadcasting Corporation. So thank you, Elizabeth. We really appreciate you being here this afternoon. And of course, our thoughts and prayers go out to you and everyone in the Solomon Islands. But we are all here as colleagues from all around the world supporting each other. Now, when we cover things such as domestic violence, a lot of people, and touching back to what you said, both of you said, things like domestic violence, and a lot of our journalists come from background where they have been subjected to either domestic violence, or their families have been subjected to it, their parents have been or particularly their moms have been subjected to domestic violence, and then they come in and cover domestic violence stories. Most of the times, I think that would not only be traumatic, but it also, I know you've tried not to touch on the mental health aspect of it, but I couldn't help myself to just draw a little bit of comparison, whereby due to that trauma and experience of trauma of domestic violence or abuse ties in with their mental health and gets them thinking about, sorry about using this term, but all sorts of negative impact of what's happening. Does that happen from experience? Guys?
Yeah,
That's a good question. And before Kimina will jump in, I just want to quickly add,
Sure.
it trigger a lot of people, particularly if you're a journalist and you've had to deal with, say, rape in your personal life, or as you mentioned, domestic violence. This is something many people, some people don't want to discuss, and they deal with it in their own personal capacity. And if you haven't dealt with it, and if you're covering another story, it could trigger you. So that's really good. And I'm also curious to hear, how incredibly damaging I'd imagine it would be to the journalist in question.
Yeah, I mean, at the Dance Centre, we encourage people when we do our sort of in-depth training to have kind of preparations, what we call before, during, and after. And before any kind of trauma exposure. And one of the things that we do in that kind of before phase is that we ask people to really reflect personally on their own life experiences, their own stress levels, their own circumstances, and ask themselves, am I strong enough to cover this story right now? So I would definitely, and that's sometimes hard, newsrooms, especially newsrooms where people have, like you described, Indra, where everybody was sick. There's one reporter left. You're gonna send that reporter out on the story regardless. But if it's possible, somebody who had prior experience of that event should really not be sent to cover it. That would be a kind of safety precaution for me. But maybe as an editor, you don't know that they have, because they haven't disclosed it to you. And that's where we come back to this overarching goal of DARTS, which is to make these conversations more able to be had, more normal, to normalize these, give people choices. And maybe if you really wanted to be a best practice editor, you could just say, look, if there is a reason that you wouldn't want to cover this story, you don't need to tell me what it is, just let me know and I'll pass it on to someone else. And it's not going to affect your career. That's the key thing to add, because as journalists, we're always afraid that if we say no to a story, or if we don't go and get that, you know, scoop, then we'll never be given another opportunity as good as that again. So part of our modeling as leaders and as editors is to make sure that our people are communicated that we will support you if you choose to avoid this story, and you won't get any consequences. Yeah.
The other thing is, while we wait for, I know a lot of people are listening, and it's just in the Pacific, you like to listen, and it's the cultural thing, you don't like to ask, and it's the shyness. But guys, you know what I'm saying is it's going to help you. But of course, later on we'll ask Wendy and the team to send out contact details to Kimina and Wame and the team if you do want to speak to them, you know, personally, individually, whatever it is. Now, this has happened before COVID, and now it's sort of gone to the next level in the Pacific, at least when I talk to a few of my colleagues around the region. Social media abuse has gone up another level. Now, it could be anti-vaxxers, it could be people who don't believe in COVID. I've just heard in our parliament a few minutes ago, or about an hour ago, where MP stood up and said certain things about the vaccine. That sort of gets people thinking, then they take it out on media because they think journalists are cooking it up, and not only from one media organization, but from all, at least. They're subjected to social media abuse. Now, does that somehow or the other tie in with trauma?
Definitely.
I mean, a lot of journalists have raised this issue with me to say, you know, their family, I mean, for us, ourselves, we've had 2 or 3 journalists in the past year, so have had threats to family, have had vulgarity all over targeted towards them. They've walked down the streets and have been taunted by many. So does that tie in with trauma, guys?
Absolutely. Well, firstly, you know, receiving a death threat is a trauma event. There's a threat to life. Whether or not that actually ever ends up getting carried out is kind of a bit irrelevant. Again, if you're thinking about what the role of your body's reaction to trauma is, which is to go into immediate emergency mode, get to safety as quickly as possible. So all of those physiological reactions happen even if the danger is not right there in front of you. So there's that element too. But the other element, I think, is something that's perhaps less understood, which is that I mentioned in the presentation that one of the key factors that make us strong is this sense of purpose, this sense of like, my work is honorable. My role as a journalist is important because I'm helping to keep the community informed. I'm helping to connect people with stories that matter. I'm helping to, you know, shine a light on darkness when, you know, there's a story that the officials want to cover up and people have been hurt by those actions, and I go in there and expose that. And that makes me a good person, and that makes me what I do worthwhile. And if we have that, and that's really strong inside of us, then it is an antidote to all of the difficulties that we experience. What's happening, and it's been happening for a long time, but it's very intense at the moment, is that we no longer have that sense of confidence that the community thinks the same about us as we think about us. And, you know, we don't have that sense of, you know, if people are kind of, and in some places, you know, people have been attacked in the street just because they've got a TV camera on their shoulder, not because of anything they actually did or said. And so that's undermining that very strong resilience factor. So what I would say to that is we all of us here in this room and all of our colleagues out there, we have to double our efforts to connect with that purpose ourselves. As much as that misinformation, that, you know, conspiracy theories and all that stuff is happening, we need to bunker down and kind of support ourselves and remind ourselves that no, what we are doing, what we do is a noble profession and a good profession, and we need to keep doing it.
Cool, that's good. We've got another question for either of you. People are warming up quite late, but it's great at least we're getting questions. What is one advice or tip that you could share with the management level? Of course, I believe this would have come from one of the journalists, to protect the journalists? Good question, I believe. So, as I said, the floor is open to either one of you to take that on.
Well,
Wame, I think you can take that.
I always like to create a safe space. You know, my team every so often, maybe once a fortnight, or generally once a month. We would usually on a Friday, and I'm fairly sure this also happens to different media organizations as well. Organize a time for we just to hang out and sit down and enjoy each other's company, have a tanoa, and just really just have a space for them to be comfortable enough to see you beyond than just the boss. Create a space for them to look at you as also a friend and a colleague. I understand it's difficult because newsrooms generally are intense. You've got deadlines to make, you've got a lot happening. We need to keep moving. There's really no time for me for one to be sort of patting people on the back and giving people thumbs up, every 25 minutes for published articles that's coming out, every an hour or so. But it is worthwhile considering creating a space where your team would look at you beyond than just being a boss, so that they could trust you. I know I've spoken quite a bit about trust, and for me, that has always been important to me. I don't make generally in my life choices unless I trust not only myself, but the other party or the other situation enough to say yes to it. And for the most part, most people are that way. If you create a space that's safe for them to just like you and trust you, and they would be able to approach you, sooner or later, they'd, would be able to tell you about, listen, it's been quite difficult. I haven't been able to sleep. This story has been eating at me for a couple of days. That's a good opportunity for you and that person to sort of figure out how you're going to manage that. That's my tip.
I've got one too. Can I have one too?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I've got two. One is bring the dart center in to do some training. So that's my sales pitch. And the second one is normalize checking in. Like make it that everybody, whoever comes back from an assignment that's been a bit tough, that the question is always asked, how you going? That was hard. How you okay? And make that so normal that the day that someone needs to say, no, I'm not okay, it's not because they've been singled out. That the normal response is just, I expect when I get back with my story that my editor's going to ask me how I am. Make that a normal thing. That would be my tip.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. I think we have got another one. So it's Elizabeth, sort of a comment. Social media, in my personal opinion, during the recent unrest in the Solomons is so traumatic. They, according to locals here, are 10 times more active than mainstream media in terms of coverage of events unfolding. Elizabeth, you're not the only one. There's so much trust that's moved away from mainstream, and I think we discussed this in the last specific meeting that we had. And mind you, please feel free to attend the next one. I'll leave Wendy to invite you to that. We'd love to have you on board. The trust that's moved across from traditional media to social media is something that we're all fighting for. And nowadays, the common person on the street has trust. And I think Wame touched on this in our meeting earlier on. But we just got to keep on fighting on. And now we will have critics, we will have supporters, we have people who don't trust the media. But again, it's just that we can't let things like that bring us down. It is traumatizing. It is that social media is sort of outdoing what traditional media has set out to do years and years ago. But we have to. But again, as I say, it's about talking. Wame, I think you touched on this a little bit, whereby the trust factor from media organizations, people align themselves to certain media organizations or totally resort to social media. I would like to touch on this quickly, maybe in a minute or so.
Sure. Yeah, it's a fairly different subject from trauma, but we're in the age now of what's been termed from abroad as fake news. And that has resulted in an incredible public mistrust in institutions, not just the media, really, government, healthcare, education, but predominantly the media. It's very different now. It certainly wasn't this way 10 years ago or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, where someone switches on the radio, opens a newspaper, and they rely on the information that they read or hear. It's tough. I'd imagine that's tough. I had it easy when I was in the mainstream media because that really wasn't happening 7 years ago. It sort of was beginning to start, but certainly not here in Fiji. This has sort of erupted in the last 2-3 years. And it's unfortunate. What are you going to do about that? How do we deal with that? Well, alluding to what Kimina had mentioned earlier on, it's finding a sense of purpose. When you do your work, when we do our work, those of us who work in media, we have to still, report objectively and be ethical and, regardless of how you feel about it, what your political allegiance is or what your beliefs are, your responsibility first and foremost is to report in an objective manner. And I generally go to sleep well at night and not worry about what trolls would say online or what someone would say on the streets. It's different now, though. People don't, turn up in your face and say things to you. At least, some of us don't experience that. Of course, some of you, unfortunately, have to deal with that as well, and even had people attack you on the streets. But yeah, how does one deal with that, Kimina? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I'm a bit like you, Wame. Like my life as a journalist was prior to all of this. And so it's a whole new level of experience. And I know some of my friends have cancelled their Twitter accounts and they just try and disengage as much as possible. And in Australia at the moment, there's this very big debate that's evolving around should the credible media organizations withdraw from Facebook, withdraw from Twitter, and just leave it to the madness, and rather than try and fight it in that context, and sort of say, if you go to Facebook for your information, then don't trust whatever you want to trust with it. At the moment, it's a mix. We're all in there trying to use Facebook to promote the truth, or as an example, Facebook, and at the same time, there's this, mix of undermining, and the algorithms are not supporting that. So, maybe we should just withdraw and just go, what, there's going to be our worldview, which is the facts are going to be over here, and that's the kind of fantasy fiction, and you can choose which world you want to enter at any time. I don't know if that's the solution or not, though. On an individual level, there's some great resources out there for particularly women journalists who are experiencing trolling, and the reality is that women do, and people of color, but and then the intersectionality of both, do experience a lot more abuse, a lot more online harassment. There are some growing organizations that I can give you some links to if you're not already aware of them, that will support you, give you some strategies of how to keep yourself as safe as you can digitally. But I'm really not an expert in this area, I'm afraid.
But it's tough.
I think whatever. Yeah, it is actually. I think, Wendy, something that we might want to look at later on, and it's some insight into the social media aspect versus the traditional media. But look, guys, I know we'll run for another 15 minutes or so, maybe just under that, because I know a lot of people have to get back to work. But I'd like to have a perspective from most probably the other parts. But great, Sajid from Pakistan Television Center in Lahore. A very good afternoon to you. Great that you have joined us, Sajid. Anwar Khan, I mean, we really appreciate this here this afternoon. Wendy, I'll bring you in, Wendy, because I think you have been dealing with a lot of our Asia Vision members. And in recent time, not only in the Pacific, I think you've heard people share about traumatic experiences. What has been your uptake on what's happened in the past 20 odd months around in our Asia Vision group, Wendy?
I honestly think there are no words. I think the photographs that Kimina put up said it all. That one that showed what we were and what we are now. And that's not on an individual level, that is literally hundreds of thousands of journalists. And I'd just like to highlight another point Kimina made that really spoke to me, and that was how you have to absolutely believe in what you're doing and that what you're doing matters. Those two aspects, I think, is how I will go forward. How it's affected people, I think it's affected our members terribly. This is just the pandemic. If you go back before the pandemic, you go, for example, to the Easter bombings in Colombo in Sri Lanka. I know, I don't know if Prasad is here. He was due to come on, but I think he's probably busy, and it's very early in Sri Lanka right now. But I know that affected him and his newsroom terribly. And so I'm sorry he's not here. I know he would have benefited. The pandemic's the same. I mean, every story that you've heard today, we each have them just in our own countries. I think not so much in the Pacific. I mean, you did working from home because your photograph showed it. But in Asia, just everyone has been working from home. At Asia Vision ourselves, we went home on the 18th of March 2020, and we have not been back. We have not seen each other. And I think it is that missing that camaraderie that we all have. We are mates, all of us, whether you're on the same, whether it's your media or someone else out there on the road, across a million emails, we are friends. And to not have that and to be reporting on a trauma for 7 billion people around the world, for now getting on 2 years, I don't think there are words to describe that. So I'm very grateful to the Dart Centre and you also, Indra, and to everyone here for getting together and starting to talk about it. We hoped when we put this up that there would be something coming out of it, and I'm hearing it in your words that there is. And next year we turn around and continue the conversation, maybe about social media. As always, it will be the pandemic, but we keep going on this. This is really important.
Thank you, Wendy. I think that is what we have learned here as well. And I really am very appreciative of this targeted towards helping Pacific journalists, because for too long, they've been not given a platform of such magnitude where they can come together and listen to people like Kimina and Wame speak about it, and then Wendy giving her perspective, and from ABU and AVN, where we're able to just open up. You know, my advice, and I know and I totally respect the cultural aspect of things, when you with your own open up, because we need to help each other. I think if we can all talk and we can drop an email from time to time, you know, as I said, our colleagues in the Solomons, in Papua New Guinea, in Vanuatu, and how can we forget that devastating the tsunami in Samoa years ago? You know, I'm just sitting down here thinking, what did the journalists go through at that time, and what counseling, if any, or any traumatic help, traumatic dealing help was offered to them? I mean, a lot of people are not aware of it, but I'm glad that Kimina and team are around, and I, for one, definitely will be exploring this more. I know you're doing some work with the other media organizations in Fiji, Kimina, but we need to talk, because at the end of the day, I've seen too many young people, in particular journalists, lose their way. I've seen editors break down. I've seen, and Imara from PNG, she broke down because she was explaining what it takes to handle this on a daily basis. So let's talk more about this. Let's not be ashamed about admitting that we are in trouble. With that, I just hand it over to the two guests to wrap it up from their perspective, and then we'll wrap this up. But of course, I'll add in a little bit more before the end. But to you both, you have the floor for about a minute each, just to wrap it all up. A little bit more than that, it'll be fine. We like to.
Let me unmute there. As I wrap up, I think I want to just say, and this is not a reminder, I'm sure you all know this, that what you do, who you are, your work, it matters. It really genuinely does, now more than ever. We're living in a time where we need good journalists, people like you, people like your colleagues, to continue to inform the public, and to really put the spotlight on issues that matter. Discussions such as this, particularly with trauma in your field of work, is important. And there's certainly no shame in you having to deal with it. As mentioned, feel free to reach out. I'm a bit of a talker, but I'm also a good listener. So if you're in around Suva, many of you who work in the media space here in Suva, I'm sure have met me or know me personally, and probably don't even know that I'm a good listener. So on a personal level, feel free to reach out and just we can have a good talanoa and have a good discussion. Or if there's a story you'd like to discuss, this is important. What you do matter. You've got a job that has incredible purpose. And I hope you understand that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Wame.
Yeah.
I mean, that means a lot, I think, particularly to the younger ones from Fiji, at least. Sometimes, as you said, we don't know who to, sometimes we'd rather talk to people who are not from the same building. So there you go, Wame's offer. Kimina, from yours before we wrap it up.
Well, I think I want to just remind people about our golden triangle, our three things: our social interaction, our physical exercise, and our sense of purpose. So there are only three things to remember. Hang on to each of those three things and develop one for you. But I also want to acknowledge that this has been a conversation that might have stirred you up, that there might be some residual kind of memories and things, the stories you might have covered in the past that you haven't thought about for a while that are coming back. So if you can, after we close off this session, take 5 minutes or much as you need to go and do something that's kind to yourself. Even if it's have a glass of water, go and lie under a tree, cuddle your puppy dog or your cat if you have one, or your child, something that is in your body that is nourishing and nurturing to yourself, and just, it's okay, allow it to just move through you if that's how you're feeling. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for the work that you do. I endorse everything that Wame just said.
Thank you very much, Kimina and Wame. And of course, I think great insight. I'd love for us to go on for another hour or two, but of course, as I said, a lot of people are going to go back to it. But Wendy, I think this has been very fruitful, and we just need to be there for each other, guys. And I'm not only talking about Fiji, but as a Pacific, as a whole, we need to support each other. All of our individual countries, we are facing difficult times, be it the pandemic, in a political crisis, be it natural disasters. We all need to support each other. And of course, today we learned the trauma and stress, etc., what it means. So let's build on that. Let's and for those of us who lead newsrooms or those lead teams, let's try and work on getting that safe space for our journalists and for our people, and let's just make it a family affair, as I call it. So thank you very much once again, guys, and I'll definitely be in touch with the DART guys. Wendy, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate what you and the team did in facilitating this here this afternoon, particularly for us in the Pacific, in Nakabakalewa.
Thank you, Indra. Yeah, today we learned what to do. Thank you, Dart. Thank you, Kimina. Thank you, Wame. Thank you, everyone, for being here.